it's our new tradition, I start 2 minutes early with the pre-announcement announcements. Next week, we are having a special Wednesday. It will be our pre-PAA presentations. Who here is presenting on Wednesday? Can you raise your hand for presenting? Okay, so we have people already taking a seat at the table. Good. For next week. And we'll also have our visiting students who we're recruiting for next year will be here next Wednesday. So that should be a fun day. And hopefully the beginning of a new tradition where we always have multiple presentations from our current students on visiting student day. Are there other announcements before we introduce our speaker? No. Then I'm delighted that Dennis has agreed to introduce our speaker, Seema, today. So take it away, Dennis.
Great, thanks. So, I'm very happy to introduce Seema Jayachandran, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Northwestern University. Professor Jayachandran studies economic issues in developing countries, including the determinants of parents' investments in their children's health, as well as topics like the environment, labor markets, and political economy. She has degrees from MIT, Oxford, and Harvard, and she's the recipient of many prestigious awards, including the Sloan Research Fellowship and an NSF Early Career Development Grant. And today, she's going to be telling us about some of her work on the well-being of children in India.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis, for the introduction, and to all of you for inviting me to present this work. So this is joint work with Rohini Pandey, who is also an economist and at the Harvard Kennedy School. And as the title indicates, it's about why are children in India so short. We're not going to give you a complete accounting of that explanation for that puzzle, but we're going to talk about one element of it, which is the role of birth order and sex preference. So this audience probably doesn't need this first introduction slide, which a lot of economists need, which is why should we care about height and child height? And the reason is that child height is determined by nutrition and disease in early childhood, which matter for the stock of health a child brings throughout their entire life. And there's a lot of evidence that children who are shorter grow up to be adults who are less healthy, less economically productive. And in Western countries, there's been a very nice and fairly consistent trend of height increasing as countries grew. GDP and height grew in tandem, and it is true in developing countries. People are getting taller, but it's less true if you look at the recent time trends and cross sections. It doesn't seem as much of a tight correlation. So one of these anomalies where height has been improving, but maybe not as fast as we would have expected or certainly wanted from a policy point of view, is India. So in India, the kind of most recent, the data I'm going to be using is from the Demographic and Health Surveys. In India, the Indian government runs it itself, and it's called the National Family Health Survey. So the statistics are from that, and the most recent one, which was in 2005-2006. So 42% of children are stunted, children under age 5 are stunted, and the average height for age Z-score is minus 1.6, meaning taking the worldwide norm population for children of their age and gender, kids are on average 1.6 standard deviations below the median. So as I said, heights have been improving in India, but it's also the last 10-20 years have been a period of very rapid economic growth, and stunting rates have fallen, but rather slowly. And when I say Indian children are short, that's not surprising in some absolute sense because India is poor. But when I say that, why do we focus on India, and we're not the first people to sort of focus on height in India among developing countries, is that even among developing countries, if you think about India's level of GDP per capita or other measures of well-being, its children's height is very low. So, for example, it has the 5th highest stunting rate in the world, and while it's poor, it's certainly nowhere close to being the 5th poorest country in the world. And the comparison we're going to use for the vast majority of this project is Sub-Saharan Africa. So Sub-Saharan Africa encompasses many countries, some of which are wealthier than India, but most of which are poorer than India. In aggregate, Sub-Saharan Africa is quite a bit poorer than India, yet children in India are shorter than children in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Question? So with body metrics, and I think we're accustomed to thinking about BMI being quite different actually across different national populations. The issues, well, there are differences in humans, right? And so if we look at a country like Japan, in fact, nutrition's been really great for quite some time, but people are smaller on average. So I guess the natural question is, well, is Africa and India, are they really comparable? If I'm not sure, but I also don't know if there's an alternative.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly the what motivated us to get into this project, and which is, and I'll come to this in a little bit. The policy debate in India has been, are we making much ado about nothing because this is all genetic differences, or some sort of differences in Indian individuals, such that this is not reflective of malnutrition. This is not going to be correlated later on with economic activity, etc. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people who work on this topic are very much of the view that we settled this, and there aren't large enough genetic differences across populations to explain this. I think this is where kind of coming in as non-experts on this, we were much more agnostic and open to sort of seeing that a lot of this doesn't seem to be explained by environmental factors. And so what you'll see is at the end of the day, I think that the main fact of this paper is hard to square with something that's entirely genetic, for example. But like I said, we're not going to explain all of the difference between India and Africa, and so some part of it might be that Indians are just different. So the core point of this paper is that we see very major differences in height by birth order. So if I compare first births in India, Indians are taller than Africans. And if I compare second-borns or third-borns in India, that's where I start to see that Indians are shorter than Africans. And so that fact, it's hard, our genotypes don't vary systematically by whether we were a parity 1 birth or a parity 2 birth. So that's at least saying some large portion of this, the height potential of Indians, we at least have a minimum, which is what firstborns are doing, and they're looking a lot better. They're still below the regression line for Africa, but they're looking halfway better. So, kind of the punchline in terms of quantitatively what we're going to be able to say is, let me explain this graph and then come back to this question. So this is both showing you the data we're going to use and showing you kind of the puzzle of Indian children being shorter than African children. In general, we're going to compare all of India to each of the sub-Saharan African countries. Here, the blue circles are different averages based on the GDP per capita in the year of birth and the mean height for age. The blue, or it probably looks gray to you, circles are African demographic and health surveys. And so the size of the circle is the size of the sample. And you can see there's an upward sloping relationship. Taller countries have taller children on average. There's a lot of dispersion, so there might be other factors going on besides health inputs and nutrition inputs, but we do see this pattern. And in red, we're breaking up India into the different states, and you see that in India as well, as states that are at different levels of development, the richer states have taller children on average. But you see that regression line for India, the intercept, is lower. The Indian regression line is lower than it is in Africa. So something's different in India compared to Africa. We're going to show another comparison group as well. And so that's the puzzle that we're trying to solve. And when I come back to kind of what are we going to give an answer to, if you think of firstborns, and especially if you look at eldest sons and families, they're going to be a lot closer to that regression line for sub-Saharan Africa. They're not going to be all of the way there, but they're going to be halfway there. And so when we think about this puzzle, I think it's, if you want to dismiss this, as I think a lot of conservative politicians in India want to dismiss this, you can dismiss half of it, but I see the policy punchline of this is at least half of it. It's hard to dismiss that portion of it. If we see within family variation, it's suggesting parents are doing something and it's some sort of input that's varying. Okay, so I think of this paper as having a fact and an explanation. And so I just told you what the fact is, which is using demographic and health surveys for 27 African countries in the latest Indian DHS, we show that this height deficit for Indian children is very much concentrated among higher parity children. And in fact, if you look at firstborns, there is no India height deficit, there's a height advantage. And so there's a large literature kind of on birth order effects. We know that there are birth order effects in lots of outcomes in a lot of societies. It's just, so here the contribution is to show there seem to be stronger in India than in other regions of the world, and they're strong enough that they explain a lot of this height variation. And so what I think this fact is interesting, certainly surprised us, and I think it changed my views on what's driving at least a big portion of this height puzzle in India. It's suggesting that behavior is not just simply genetics. Behavior, it's hard to square these birth order patterns with genetics. And even if you were already on board that probably this was all environmental, I think for me it added nuance to what sort of environmental explanation we need, which is something related to take-up of services as opposed to just pure access. So I think a lot of the conversation in India right now, in a lot of places, is about access. We need better infrastructure, better sanitation, more health clinics, or what have you. And here, it's unlikely that families are seeing the systematic difference in their access to infrastructure when they have their first child versus their second child versus their third child. They're just availing themselves of those resources differently. So I think it's a much more complicated policy problem to get inside the family and change how families are prioritizing some children over the others. But that at least is, I think, kind of what is needed to solve some portion of this. So then the second part of the paper is about, so why is there this very strong birth order gradient in India compared to other places? So, we see it everywhere. Families, they're both kind of preference reasons and maybe rational reasons to really emphasize the firstborn child, but it's stronger in India than elsewhere. And so we're going to propose and show you some supporting evidence that the explanation is at least in part related to eldest son preference. So probably you're familiar with that India has son preference, and so there's a lot of supporting evidence and tons of existing literature suggesting that, and we're going to be focusing on a very specific aspect of the way son preference works in India, as well as China and a lot of patrilocal societies, which is very much valuing that first son, the eldest son. And there are deep reasons why in India the eldest son is favored. Some of those are cultural, or in terms of or societal norms about elderly parents living with their eldest son and taking over the family name and land, etc. And then there are also religious reasons, for salvation. When people die, when they're cremated, it's their eldest son who lights the funeral pyre. And so for those reasons, the eldest son matters. And so we're going to show you that by looking both kind of at different subgroups that vary, showing you these birth order gradients are very strong among subgroups in India that have very strong son preference, and then also showing you some nuanced patterns about how height varies with not just your own birth order or gender, but your siblings' birth order and gender.
Do economists have any reason why this preference for first sons as opposed to last sons, or I guess there's an anthropological literature on this. I'm very interested in. So certainly we're not going to make progress on that question. We take as given that families seem to value their first son rather than their any later son. I guess there can be a view that this is there's certainty around this one, and there's uncertainty about having that future son. But I don't have any. Certainly, I don't think economists have said much about this, and I don't have anything new to say about it.
When you speak of the birth order gradient, is GDP figured into that, or is this just the z-scores? Is it relative to the regression line? My question is that is income rising? Is the bar rising for the younger children? So if subsequent births are the same height, they actually look shorter by this measure because GDP is risen.
I see. So you're saying that later born kids, their births are born when their country's on average richer, so that should help them.
No, actually I'm asking the other question, how are you measuring it? Are you taking GDP into account? Is it relative to their GDP, or is it simply?
It's just simply relative to their siblings. So in some ways we're kind of stacking things a little bit against ourselves, because we would expect in general later born, in a fast-growing societies, later born children, I guess. I use GDP to kind of give this motivational graph, but after that, I'm just going to be using, looking without kind of adjusting for anything. Okay, so then, time permitting, or in post-talk discussions, I can tell you, we also kind of thought about when we we didn't come in with this view that it's going to be eldest son preference. This was certainly a paper where we had this fact, and then we thought about what are the possible explanations, and the evidence seems to support the eldest son one. Two other ones we thought about and the evidence doesn't support are some view that maybe it's about, still related to gender, but about mother's health, that if women are discriminated against in India, they enter childbearing less healthy, and maybe that is kind of has this progressive effect. So their health deteriorates fast because they start out with a lower stock, and the burden is on the later born children. So we can use a mother's height as a proxy for her health stock, and that doesn't seem to be what's the explanation. The other could be there could just be some difference in the income profiles in Africa versus India. Maybe in India you have your incomes are declining with age, or or at least they're not rising as quickly as in Africa. Maybe there's a really high returns to experience in African income, and families can't shift income over time because they have no access to savings or credit, and that doesn't seem to be the explanation. So we're very interested in other thoughts on what might drive these quite stark differences in preferences for firstborn kids in across societies.
Sorry, so is the son preferences, that's a particularly Indian thing? That's not true in African countries?
It's not true in African countries, and even so, there are various ways you could think about how do we measure this. So it's people stating what kids they want, or seeing where sex selection is common, etc. And so, I think there is in some North African countries, we're looking at sub-Saharan African countries, there are quite similar patterns. And I should even say, even within some preference, so here's I think things that are puzzling or surprising to people if they're not familiar with India, which is this desire for an eldest son is much more common among Hindus than Muslims. So there's much more sex selection among Hindus than Muslims, and so I think at least if you listen to the U.S. presidential debates, Muslims are talked about more in our society, and we think of there not being a lot of gender equality. And so there's what we're focusing on is really the eldest son, and in that sense, this kind of son preference, even among the places we think of as life is not necessarily great for women, I think it's this particular form, and it says India and China are very prominent places, other places with Confucianism, which also favors an eldest son, and then a lot of patrilocal societies. So the Caucasus is another region where there's a strong preference for an eldest son, and some of my other work is on how fertility decline makes the sex ratio worse, and it's because you see this very strongly in the Caucasus, which is people really want that eldest son. They used to be having 5 kids, in the communist era, and now they're having 2 kids, and the need to have a sex-selective proportion to get your one son is much stronger. Is there any other questions?
I'll ask you later.
Just going back to your point on the previous slide about the maternal depletion. So you said you looked at height. Did you look at any factors that could change over time more easily?
Yeah, we did. So I'm not going to talk about this. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But we also looked at kind of food consumption of mothers and hemoglobin, and look what happened. Are women just getting mistreated over time in India? And to the extent that's happening, it's happening only during pregnancy. So it's either that India mistreats pregnant women over time, or it's then at that point it's sort of hard to separate out. Is that's because you're investing less in the child? Because otherwise, I think if you were just being sort of misogynistic over time, it would be at all moments in women's life. Okay. So let me just not go through the slide except to say this is a big policy debate in India because height is so well measured, or at least that versus other measures. In this growth versus poverty reduction debate in India, policies that have promoted growth, have they left the poor behind? The big black mark has been child height is still very low, and so there's been this debate about is that malnutrition, where the opposition has said no, if you're in favor of pro-growth policies, you say that's not malnutrition, that's a genetic difference. And so that's where we got this on our radar screen to start looking at this question. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the previous literature, but this puzzle of Indian children being short is out there in the literature. Okay, so let me just dive in. I'm going to talk about height and then show you these similar patterns of parents seeming to invest more in early born children in India relative to other places. It's also true when you look at inputs, like prenatal inputs and postnatal inputs, and then talk about eldest son, and I'll at least kind of, if time permits, say a little bit about the alternative explanations. So most of you are probably familiar with the demographic and health surveys, which are fielded in low and middle income countries. We're going to use the ones that sandwich the Indian one, which was in 2005, 2006. So we're going to use the ones from 2004 to 2010 in 27 sub-Saharan African countries. And these are the entire 27 surveys in 25 countries. And this is the full set that have anthropometric data over this time period. And then I'm going to show you, or at least talk about robustness. We're going to use other comparison groups because, maybe African societies just favor later born kids and, with relative comparisons. But you're going to see that it really seems to be something anomalous about India. So our sample is going to be children from India in these African surveys under age 5 for whom we have anthropometric data, which is 174,000 children. And our main outcome is going to be the height for age z-score. And all the patterns I'm going to show you we find them to be stunting as an indicator.
So these are z-scores against the United Nations,
yeah, exactly.
World Health Organization, Western standard.
Exactly. And so the WHO, in some ways it's not Western anymore, right? So the WHO has a reference group of children who are children, and I think the important thing here to think about these numbers is that they're healthy children, but healthy children meaning they don't have any known pre-existing health conditions, and they were the parents say they'll give them the immunizations and have breastfeeding for at least 4 months, and so you think of these as the healthier children, because otherwise, if all of the developing world has kids with z-scores under -1, we can't make sense of the data. So think of this as, even in the US, the z-scores would be less than 0 on average. So it's, I'm sure there's a big political discussion about having representation from different parts of the world, but it's a reference group from Brazil, Ghana, India, Norway, Oman, and the United States, and so for each child age and month, so 17-month-old girls, you have a set of children from around, from these countries, and their height. It's going to be a distribution. If you're the median, you're a z-score of 0, and then if the standard deviations above or below is going to be the z-score.
So you're limiting to kids under 5, so does that mean that within family comparisons are limited to siblings that are within 4 years of each other?
Exactly. So this is a good, I'm going to come to this, we're going to do 2 things. One is, so this is because of the data limitations. The DHS collect data on child height for children under age 5. And so the women we're going to see here haven't completed their fertility, but we're going to see, if they have children under age 5. And so a lot of what I'm going to show you is not going to be looking within families. It's going to be looking at kind of everybody, and we're going to say, well, kids, when we see a third-born child, they're in a bigger family, right? So we're also going to be looking within family, and then you're only in the sample if your birth spacing is less than 4 years or something to be in the sample. And I'm not going to show you the backup slides to show you this, but it's going to be a different sample because. But most people, the birth spacing is typically under 48 months or whatever it is, and so when we look within families, the average birth spacing is 28 months. Whereas if we didn't make that restriction to looking at siblings, the average birth spacing is about 36 months. And so you have to take that in mind, to keep that in mind when you think about within family comparisons. But it doesn't seem like a crazy restriction. In fact, for robustness, we're going to look at the earlier NFHSs, and mainly that's just useful because when I start thinking about gender, there was much less sex selection then, but with those earlier NFHSs, they only collected height up to age 3 or up to age 4, and then so if you only had children under age 3, at that point I become very uncomfortable looking at fixed effects within a family, comparing 2 siblings that are both under age 3, because you might get a 1-month-old and a 3-year-old, but you start to get a much shorter birth spacing, much more anomalous. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the summary statistics in the interest of time. Here's the main fact, which is this is just plotting the averages, the raw data, and then I'll do regression adjustment. But the first set of bars are firstborn children. So these are all children in the data set who were the first child born to their parents, and you can see that the blue bar is Africa and the red bar is India. And just to make it more readable, the scale isn't going to 0, so these are both, this is off of -1.2. These are both negative numbers, so the z-scores are below 0 in Africa and India, but they're less negative in India than in Africa. So it's not a huge difference, but you're going to see it's statistically significantly different. And then when you get to birth order 2, that's where you start to see Indian children seem quite a bit shorter than African children. And when you get to 3rd and higher, and we're going to group 3+ because there aren't as many, you start to get thinner and thinner categories, but we see the same results if we break that out. When you get to higher birth order kids, that's where you really start to see there's a big gap between what's happening in India and in Africa.
Just to follow up on the earlier discussion so I understand, the birth order 3 child could be 5 years old in this calculation?
Yes.
It could be the oldest child under 5?
Exactly.
Okay, but later when you do your fixed effects, the birth order 2 or 3 child is always going to be younger?
Yes, exactly. And so, and in those we're going to, so this data, what I'm showing you here is just everybody. So it's some, some are going to be, we're going to make cross-family comparisons and within-family comparisons. And so that, you have to be under age 5. So if you are a 5-year-old, you're not going to have an older sibling in the sample, but when we do the within family, there's just going to be a mechanical correlation between age and.
Is the trajectory in India and Africa of Z-scores with age the same? Are they
So
parallel?
they're fairly similar, but when we do this, we're going to control for child age in months, child age interacted with India. So we're going to allow for the different time profiles to differ, precisely because birth order and age within a family are so tightly correlated. Maybe there's just different age profiles, so we control for that reason.
I think the within family models will get rid of this concern, but is there, I just don't know the context of fertility in India, but in the between family models, it seems like if higher SES women are just having 1 kid, then that could be not a birth order story, but a class differential story.
Yeah, let me get to this, because the fact, I just sort of like this, of all my papers, this is the one where like the raw data show it, and then all the regression adjustment shows the same thing. So here's the regression model, which is, it looks more complicated than it is. It's just going to be birth order 1, 2, 3+, or 1 is the omitted category, and then interactions with India. What's the relative difference in India for being a 2nd-born or a 3rd-born? And so in everything we're going to control for a cubic in the year, month that the survey was conducted, and that's just because, coming back to this earlier point, maybe if the survey was later, kids are taller, and, India is in the middle of our African data sets, but it's not exactly. And we're going to control for dummy variables for the child's age, and that's just for precision, that there is this general time profile of kind of decreasing and then increasing z-scores over the first 5 years of life, and that's for precision. But then when we do within family comparisons, we're going to interact with age with India to allow those patterns to differ. Okay, so when we just make these between family comparisons, it could just be that when we see a higher parity child, because of the way the data is sampled, where we see under age 5, we're not going to see total fertility for women, so we can't control for, this was a family that had a total family size of 5. We don't know what they're going to stop at. But when we compare a 3rd-born and a 2nd-born, it's very likely that the 3rd-born is going to be part of a family that had higher fertility. And so we know that the families that have higher fertility or have less educated parents are going to be poorer, going to be more rural, etc. And so maybe this is not a birth order comparison, it's an SES comparison. And so how are we going to address that? We're going to do it in 2 ways. So I think the one that controls for it in the most the most stringent way is to have mother fixed effects, or kind of sibship fixed effects, where we put in a fixed effect for having the same family and we're getting siblings. And so that has the advantage that it controls for the parents' education and rural access to infrastructure, etc., at least time invariant. And then, but it's a selected sample of the ones who have a sibling under age 5. So basically, about half the sample, a little less than half the sample, falls into this sibling. If we restrict the sample to having a sibling in the sample, it's about half the sample. Then for many outcomes, and when we start to look at the eldest son hypotheses, where we start to lose power if we look at these within family comparisons, and so then we're going to have try to address this with control variables. So we're going to have a bunch of, when we have India interacted with being a higher parity child, we're going to in parallel control for India times the measures of SES we have. So it's going to be mother's literacy, whether you're rural or urban. We're also going to control for the mother's age, interacting with India, because later born kids, their mother is older, maybe this is effectively maternal age, etc. And so that's going to be, it's not going to have, there might be some omitted unobservables about SES we don't control for, but that's how we're going to do it. Okay, so here's the results. So column 1 is just what's the average difference in Z-scores in India versus Africa. So it's 11 Z-score points. In some way, this is underestimating the puzzle because India is richer. If I said how far below was it the regression line for Africa, it's actually minus 0.4 on the Z-score scale. And here is the exact equivalent of what I showed you in the bar chart, except controlling for child age for precision. And so you see Indian firstborn kids are taller than African firstborn kids. That's how you want to interpret this omitted, this main effect. That's the omitted category of firstborns. Indian kids are taller. Then once you get to secondborns, that's where Indians do relatively worse than in Africa. And if you add those two together, on net, Indian secondborns are shorter than African secondborns. And and we see that for thirdborns as well. So that's without kind of adjusting for SES differences, etc. And then these successive columns are starting to adjust for things. So in this third column, we're controlling for these household covariates. Let's allow maternal literacy, being rural, etc. And in the last column, we're allowing mother's age, which is also correlated with birth order. And sorry, I went through that quickly, but you're going to see that this attenuates the coefficients. So some of this seemed to be an SES about SES, but a lot of it seems to be a true effect and is stable when we add covariates. Here's when we're also adding child age times India, so allowing this different profile with age in India than in Africa. Here's actually with mother fixed effects. So here's with mother fixed effects. So this is the specification where all of the identification, all of the estimates of these coefficients are from children who have another sibling in the sample. And so we're taking out the fact that they're different ages by controlling for that, and we still see this within families. In India, the later born children are doing relatively worse compared to their siblings.
I just had a question. Are you going to talk about child sex at all? Boys versus girls?
Yeah. So that's going to be the back half is going to be about child gender. And then the last two columns are just saying, we see the same patterns. We can use stunting, we can use height, etc. And just to be clear, there's a birth order gradient in Africa. That's how to interpret these two coefficients, which are the omitted regional category, which is sub-Saharan Africa. Secondborns do worse than firstborns, and thirdborns do even worse. But it's just it's a much stronger pattern in India. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about robustness, but we've thought about fertility differences between India and Africa. In some way that works against us because these thirdborn categories tend to be higher births in Africa. We can restrict it to non-polygamous families. So what are we doing here? You might say, well, is this about India being different, or is this about Africa having a particularly weak birth order gradient? So here, rather than Africa, we're using two different comparison groups. One is to use the demographic and health surveys that are similar GDP per capita to India. And then the other is to use Western and Central Asia, which tends to be much richer than India, but to the extent that there have been genetic mappings and migration patterns, it's most similar genetically to Indian children. And in both cases, you see, to those other comparison groups, the birth order gradient is stronger in India than elsewhere, and in Africa and those other places, the birth order gradients look similar. So when you look at Central Asia, even firstborn kids in India are much shorter than firstborn kids in Europe and Central and West Asia. It's poorer, but you see this, it falls off more steeply there as well. So coming back to what I was said at the very beginning, if you thought about Indian firstborn kids and can put them on the regression line for Africa, there's still a puzzle of what's going on, and I'm going to be silent on whether that's open defecation, which has gotten a lot of press attention recently as something that might explain it, whether it's genetics, but at least this part, it's hard to make an argument that this Indian's height potential isn't this high when we see it systematically with firstborn children. Okay, so the fact that you see within families these differences is suggesting that, as I said, it's about take-up of services. So And when we look at health, so it's about take-home services, and so the DHS has some data about prenatal visits, vaccinations, etc. I'm not going to show you the regression tables, but we see the same patterns with that. That Indian families drop off the investments they make in their children's health with the successive births much more dramatically than happens in Africa. So at least for us, that's suggesting that it seems to be some some action and not just something passive or something spurious.
Shouldn't this largely interfamily variation largely be driven by nutritional investments, since recovery from gastrointestinal infection isn't probably the driving?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I should say these investments we have are not what I think are driving height. We don't have the data in the DHS to look at, the eldest sons get fed more milk in India than their other siblings. We don't have those data. So I think of the inputs we have as just some proof that parents do seem to favor some children over others, and that's,
You have consumption data though, right?
No.
Oh, no, that's fine. But you do have breastfeeding. Do you see differences about breastfeeding?
Yeah, so I have some other work on breastfeeding that suggests that ends up getting driven also by this desire to have kids quickly in India. So, if you don't have a son yet, you have very short birth spacing. So we see it, but we've omitted that. So we have, so
It's not in your...
it's not in the...
and birth intervals are not...
So birth intervals don't... So by birth order, the birth order intervals don't differ systematically in India versus Africa, but you do see something if you look at conditioning on the gender of the child. So,
Well, and the first time may not be... there are many explanations why birth intervals are related to child health, but the first time is obviously going to be very different from the other kids, even if you don't see difference in birth intervals for the other kids, but the preceding interval for the first time is...
You mean
nature is going to be...
proceeding for the first, meaning from marriage?
Yes. Or just, there is no interval, right, for the interval for the first time, so you would expect the first time to be different from the other.
Yeah, no, and the question is why is that different in India than in Africa? And so maybe we can try. I'm not understanding. Sorry. I should also say we see the same patterns for other kinds of measures of child well-being. So weight. Even firstborn kids are much lower weight in India than in Africa. So we don't get this kind of reversal. But the birth order gradient is stronger. We see it for hemoglobin. We see it for infant mortality. So later born kids are more likely to die relatively in India. So think of this as this is not causing height, but it's suggesting this is a broad-based pattern. So let me explain the kind of our explanation for why there's a strong birth order gradient, and then kind of talk about the results if probably don't have time to talk about the results. I mentioned the kind of strong desire for eldest sons, and it's going to affect resource allocations in two ways. One is you're going to give more resources to some kids versus the others. You're going to favor your eldest son, and even beyond eldest sons, boys get more than girls, but especially the eldest son. But it's also going to affect fertility decisions. And so someone asked about gender, and I should say, this is a fact I haven't seen in the literature, but it's quite striking. This, Indian kids that people have said, within India, it doesn't look like girls are doing worse than boys on Z-scores, but in some ways, it's because if you add a comparison group of Africa, then in Africa, girls' Z-scores are much higher than boys, and so relative to Africa, all of the anomaly in India is in girls. But let me tell you why eldest son preference can generate a birth order gradient, because I think part of it is trivial and part of it is more subtle. So it's, I think, easy to see why it generates a birth order gradient among boys. Your eldest son he might not be birth order 1, but by definition, he has to be lower birth order, lower parity than any of his brothers, right? That's what we mean by the eldest son. So how does it generate it among girls? So you're going to invest more in him, and he's going to look better than his brothers, and so if we look within the sons in a family, we'd see a gradient. So with girls, it's more subtle. So first of all, later born girls are more likely to have an older brother, and so if you're a firstborn girl, you're born at birth order 1 girl, you're not going to have any brothers. If you're a birth order 3 girl, you may or may not, but on average, you're going to be more likely to have an eldest son, and he's going to be soaking up a lot of resources. but then it's also related to fertility stopping. And so people have long noted that in India, people stop having, keep having kids till they have a son. But this can affect investments because, the birth of a girl is a surprise to a family where they have to update and have more kids. So I think this is an example of a family that wants to have 2 children, which is the modal preference in India, but they really want to have a son. So I think this explains Indian preferences quite a bit. So if you don't have a son, so say you were thinking, I'm going to have 2 kids, I want 1 son, in expectation that's going to happen. But if you just had a girl at birth order 1, then you think, okay, well now I'm going to have 2 more to have a son in expectation, or if you're overly optimistic, you think, I'm still going to have my son next time. Now imagine you have that second daughter, you now have to revise your fertility upwards again. So now you have to have at least 3 kids, in expectation 4, in order to obtain your son. So when you're investing in that second daughter, you're investing in her with a higher expected family size than when you had that first daughter and we're investing in her. So these girls, and so what do you do when you say, I have my second born daughter, and you say, I didn't get a windfall of income, but now I'm going to have a higher number of children in order to have a son. You have to cut back on many things, and part of that is cutting back on the investments in daughters. And so these later born girls are going to be, in some ways, the collateral damage of this desire to have a son, even relative to other girls in the family, meaning their older sisters. And what's interesting is, so if you think about it, you can't go back and take away from your firstborn girl because you already invested in her. And what's interesting is, this is not in the paper, but if you look at things later in life, like schooling, it kind of gets equalized among daughters. But for these early investments, the later born daughters that are kind of negative surprises for a family, they bear a lot of the brunt of the cutback in resources. So just to kind of recap that, if you're a firstborn daughter, if you're totally rational, the spending on her is in a family that wanted 2 kids but really wants a son, and if you're totally rational, you expect the family size to be 3. If she has a sister after her, that investments in her is going to be with a family size of 4, and so with a fixed income, the resources per child is going to be lower.
But aren't people constrained in a given period? The food is on the table. I'm not saving food for my next child. How
so I guess if there's absolutely no savings, then it can't work, right? You can't save, but people do have certain savings, right? Like they have gold, and you get, like lots of, at the marriage, part of the dowry is often gold, and you spend that down, and whether you spend that down, so in a world with absolutely no...
I can see school fees or something. I'm having trouble imagining it for the how much rice do you get, which is what's determining this, right?
And health investments insofar as they're going to affect height. Okay, so let me just say that birth order gradient exists for both genders. So there are 2 kinds of facts that kind of support this idea that eldest son preference is related to the birth order gradient. One is the birth order gradient in India. If we look within India, it's highly concentrated among subgroups that are known to have stronger son preference. So we don't see it in Kerala, which is the matrilineal state in India, and among Hindus and Muslims, it's much stronger among Hindus than among Muslims. And so that sort of suggests, prima facie evidence that these 2 things are linked. And then the second kind of evidence, it's maybe a little bit more complicated to explain quickly, but it's related to postnatal and prenatal investments. The story I told where, the arrival of a daughter, you realize, oh, I need to cut back on investments. That's going to happen after she's born, or certainly after you determine it was a daughter. And in fact, prenatally, in those families that don't have a son yet, girls are going to be the beneficiaries. You're going to invest a lot in that pregnancy because you might be pregnant with your eldest son. And so when we see these children, these girls who get lower investments, it's highly concentrated in the postnatal investments rather than the prenatal. Again with the caveat that these are probably not the main determinants of height, but these are still decisions parents are making about taking iron supplements, or we see this with the mother's food consumption as well, versus vaccinations, etc. So let me just sort of stop with this in the interest of time, and happy to talk about the other things. But this is Hindus versus Muslims. Muslims on average are poorer than Hindus in India. So this is also kind of, but you see that the height gradient, Hindus are shorter by birth order 3, whereas they're taller at birth order 1.
These are 95% intervals, or?
Yes.
These are unadjusted or adjusted?
These are unadjusted, and then we have the regression table that adjusts it in the same way I showed you before.
Have you when you talk about the first child, do you kind of take advantage of the ability to look at the oldest son, when the oldest son is a third child versus, you have this kind of natural experiment, and I would think that that this could play to the advantage of the later births if you were a son. In other words, a third birth if you're the first son shouldn't be penalized in your theory.
Yeah.
Is that what happens?
Yeah. So, and by the way, I assume I should stop now.
Yeah.
I have other things I can go through, including something on this. So, if you think about, I sort of, mucked up the language because it's hard to distinguish between eldest sons and birth order. But some eldest sons are born at birth order 1, some are born at birth order 2, and that girl-boy story, some are born at birth order 3. And so, what's interesting, so it's not that a birth order 3 son should do as well as a birth order 1 son for a couple of reasons. One is that, one reason, which is your family still, they didn't spend 0 on those 2 daughters, right? So, they still had to had fewer resources per child, even for you. But we do see that you do better than, so you do the best in your family. So basically, eldest sons always do well, regardless of birth order. But even among eldest sons, where we're comparing across families, the eldest sons born at birth order 1 or 2 do better than the ones born at birth order 3 and higher.
Okay, but within the family, when the eldest son is born at a later parity, you should have a flat parity gradient. If it's girl, girl, boy, you should have a relatively flat gradient, as opposed to if it's boy, girl, girl.
Isn't it so there aren't many girls in India left,
Okay.
but you're saying like girl boy versus boy girl.
Sure.
Yeah, no, exactly. So
That's going to flatten the gradient.
so it's going to flatten it, and so we still see that there seems to be both a general son preference and a general birth order gradient that is not fully explained by this eldest son, but it gets flattened. So if you look at, so if a family has 2 kids and it's boy girl versus girl boy, they had their ideal family size, they got their 1 son, they're happy. If you want to be hyper rational and think about it, the one who had a girl first wasn't sure if they were going to be able to stop at 2 or not, so there could be differences. But we see that the eldest son does the best in both of those families, and the birth order gradient is, can be reversed in the girl-boy case because a gender eldest son dominated birth order. Is that what you're asking?
I guess so. This is in Africa and India.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a birth order effect in both countries.
Yeah.
But in India, there's a son effect.
Yeah.
I guess just my intuition is that the son effect should flatten the apparent birth order effect because the first son can appear at any birth order, and half the time it's going to be a second child.
I see.
So you may be understating the birth order effect. If
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand the question. Yeah, so if the only thing you care, the only attribute of your child that determined how you favored one versus the other was birth order, you get a strong gradient. In India, there's this other thing that looms even larger, which is sons, and so that flattens it. That flattens it relative to if you didn't have that, yes.
So can we see that in your analysis?
So we've done it with and without controlling for gender. I don't have it in the tables.
But just pushing on that a little bit, supposing you were to tag the firstborn son in each household and just have that be a dummy variable, firstborn son, and then once you've controlled for that status, then you look and you see whether there remains a birth order effect and there remains a gender effect.
Exactly. So we have done that, and so that's what I thought Josh was asking. When you do that, there's still a birth order gradient. So eldest son, it's attenuated. So if you think, can you kind of explain away the birth order gradient by just saying eldest son, and tends to be born at low birth order, you diminish the birth order gradient, but there still seems to be some birth order gradient we don't explain completely. And then similarly with gender, I mean, certainly sons, kind of all sons are favored over.
Okay, well, that's a different, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So then you've got multiple patterns going on.
Yeah, exactly. So I think of this as, you know, there's this whole question of like, why is India shorter than, why are Indian kids shorter than African kids? And we can't explain all of it. Like I showed you, you know, there's still some gap that could be genetics or open defecation or water or what have you. And then within the question, so that's one piece of this project. And the other is, why is there a stronger birth order gradient in India? And part of it is eldest son, so exactly like you're saying, if you could put in eldest son, can you knock out this birth order gradient? You don't fully knock it out, but you partly knock it out. So even there, you know, I think we've explained part of why India seems to have this stronger preference for earlier born children, but there must be some explanation that's also going on.
But follow on to that, so then the last thing is, so how much of the India difference do you explain with firstborn sons?
Yeah, so I haven't done that accounting exercise, but it's a good one to do. Yeah.
So the same question is basically, so if people reinvested or changed their allocation pattern, would this necessarily improve this bigger problem, right? So you're shifting some towards your girls or something.
Yeah, no. I mean, this is an important question, which is within family, is this sort of zero sum that would the average of kids be better? And I think this is not what we aim to do in the paper, but if you thought about the production function of height and inputs, my guess is there's diminishing return. So that if you took the same inputs of a milk, or even if we didn't think average heights would increase, we might think that the implications of stunting and being in the bottom tail are strong. There's some nonlinearity in the importance of low z-scores, and so it might be better to kind of not change the average, but narrow the inequality. And then I just think from a fairness, equity point of view, this is interesting. But yes, I think kind of in the back of our minds, of the view that this explains part of the puzzle. When I showed you Indian firstborns, we can't get every kid getting up there without more resources or strongly diminishing returns. But I think it's at least my prior is that kind of giving all of the milk to the eldest son, you might kind of improve average welfare by spreading it out.
By reducing significant mortality, among other things.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about the Ken's question about the norming, but rather from a more sociological perspective, that in India you don't see a stunted child as a problem because all the other children are small. So to what extent is this kind of a social contagion, social norming process in India that people say, oh, your child isn't small, you don't. Again, I'm trying to understand what the elasticity in inputs is for a parent, and are they so constrained that they're saying, no, you can't have seconds, or are they just not saying, you need to eat more, type of thing?
It's an interesting point about whether they're not going to the pediatrician until your child is in the 5th percentile of the worldwide distribution, and so in their village they might be in the median, and so they're not upset about that. Yeah, I don't actually. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. Kind of how people perceive. Are they alarmed at this? What's the kind of? What's equating the level of alarm of parents? What height gap would make people equally alarmed in India as Africa as the U.S. about a child height? In terms of food inputs, so part of it is not people are eating meals, but I don't think many people are having seconds. Like these is still pretty poor households, and it's not just quantity; it's also and milk is just a good example because that's like a well-known norm of there's also just ordering of eating food. So sort of like male adults, then kids, and then women, and then within the kids, I think there's kind of like a less well-known norm, but it's perfectly acceptable to have inequality in food consumption with the household and enforce it. And when I say enforce, I'm not but like so in that sense, it's not crazy to think that you could have major inequality across kids in food inputs. I mean, there's also kind of, coming back, I think part of it is also disease, diarrhea and recovery and going to a doctor or what have you, and parents are, systematically more likely to take their sons to the doctor if they're sick than their daughters, and their eldest sons versus other sons, and so that's just another component where, I think it's beyond the scope of what we're able to say of like what is the big accounting exercise for all of the choices parents make and what's their contribution to height. And like I said, we're constrained within the DHS of things that I don't think are the major contributors to height. So some kind of project I want to do, it's almost like food diaries within India or some fly on the wall looking at some of this to see what are because right now we don't have good data on what are probably the high R-squared determinants of height within families, which are food consumption and sort of remediation after episodes of dysentery. Did you have a question? Okay.
Well, I was originally going to ask about this balance between nutrition and disease and parasite.
Yeah.
You might want to talk a bit about that, but I gather the balance between the balance of determinants between the infection and parasite burden and the raw nutrition is not very clear.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
we don't know that, but that is in some ways in thinking about mechanisms.
Yeah.
That's a fairly strong mechanism. That set me then wondering about another possible artifact. Within family analysis is the most convincing part because the associations between family size and all the concomitants of poverty, rural residence, and other things are so strong. So it seems to me your best case is in the within family comparisons. But within those, the earlier born children within a family are necessarily having their height measured at a later age and being compared to the later age standard. So there is an issue of whether, if there could be typical catch-up growth in India, possibly reflecting the kinds of parasite burden that is characteristic of India as compared to tropical Africa. If there were catch-up growth, then you would see some of this effect, because if you were measured older, you would be closer to international standards. If you're measured younger, it's not an easy thing to control for, but I think it is worth thinking about, because height studies have been somewhat, I won't say plagued, but they're troubled by the relevance or non-relevance of the WHO standards. And you're bringing in, so there are growth curves. There's a lot of heterogeneity in growth curves across different parts of the world. WHO has one growth curve, and somehow it dates from the old days when there were model life tables based on Southern Europe that were being applied to Africa. There's a kind of tradition of applying model standards.
Yeah, no, and I think Josh has a similar question at the beginning. I think it's an important point. And so just to be clear, when we make comparisons within family, we're adjusting for the fact that by age, there might be different catch-up in India than in Africa. Because we have in everybody in the regression, even if they don't have a sibling, right? And that those are helping us capture the ages. So I might have a third-born in the data set who's 5 years old. They don't have any siblings in the data set, but this way I can still trace out separately. I can parse out how India is different from Africa in terms of the age of z-scores, how they catch up, and birth order. So, we have age and month, and I take the point that this is an important subtlety, but in that sense, we are able to do this. This is where even in the within family, using some of the data from the between family helps us see how do the age profiles look different, Z-score profiles look different in India and Africa.
So is the age coefficient positive?
I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that, but I have it on my.
So you showed us the regression with the interactive age score, but didn't have the coefficients.
Reported,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So when I showed you, if I showed you something like this that had mother fixed effects, not reported, but in the regression is India interacted with the child's age. So, and how do I identify age and birth order at the same time when I'm looking within families is because I still have the other observations that are between families. And so I just didn't report them. I could give you the answer afterwards. It's somewhere on my laptop.
We should stop here. So thanks so much.
Thank you.